بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So last time we had started talking about what happens when there's a difference of opinion over a narrator. So how do we deal when we have a difference of opinion over a particular narrator? And I said that there are basically three major ways for us to deal with this. The first one is saying, is there actually a difference of opinion, right? That's the first thing that we need to realize and the first thing that we need to investigate. Is this something that's real or is it something that's perceived? Secondly, once we decide that there is a difference of opinion and it's something that's actually has been established, then we need to make a decision like, okay, do I choose one or the other? If I don't have enough information to decide one over the other, I do something which is just called tawaqquf, or I suspend the ruling on that individual or that particular narrator. So these are things that we had spoken about. What I want to do today is I want to actually spend time, is there an actual difference of opinion? And we're going to spend time on this issue in particular. So firstly, we had said, is the ascription sound? Meaning that is what this imam said about this narrator something that is actual? Can it be ascribed to him? There are a number of things for us to investigate in that. The second thing, is it reconcilable? So even if we have these differences of opinion, is there a way for us to actually reconcile that? Can we look at it in a way that allows us to bring maybe two opposing opinions together? And lastly, if it's something that's irreconcilable, is it possible that that scholar, when he made that judgment, he was just unjust in what he said? All of these three are possibilities that happen when we come with to deal with a particular narrator. So checking the ascription. Is he from the list of accepted scholars? And we had spoken about this before. We had talked about this. The chain. Can the ascription be verified of him saying it, right? Did he actually say it or not? Is the statement relayed properly from the imam? This is something that's important as well. Did the imam himself make a mistake in his ruling on that narrator? And again, all of these we're going to explore more. Unacceptable. So the reason that he criticized the narrator, was it for something that is worthy of being dismissed? Was the statement of the imam misunderstood? This is also a possibility. Also, misascribed. Was the statement from the imam, or could it have been from someone else and it got misascribed to him? Or is it misapplied? Meaning, so this one is about the imam, this one is about the narrator that is being spoken about. So there could be a mistake in the imam and what he said, and there could be a mistake in the narrator and who it actually applies to, and the timeline. The difference between an early critic and a later critic, and we had spoken about this, that the ones who came later, they mainly relay the information. They're not actually doing critique themselves. So the imam, yes. I'm sorry? And they're all possible, right? They're all possible. Alhamdulillah, it's usually one over the other versus all of them. So it's not that bad. So it must come from someone whose statements are accepted in Jarh wa Ta'dil. So I gave here, we have 4 examples. We have Abu Abbas ibn Uqda, Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Sa'id ibn Abdul Rahman, Abu al-Fath al-Azdi, Muhammad ibn Hussein ibn Ahmad, Abi Tahir, Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Uthman al-Umawi. So he said, if any of these people, they made statements in Jarh wa Ta'dil, their statements would be rejected. Why? Because they're not from the list of accepted narrators or the accepted critics in Jarh wa Ta'dil. But what else does that tell us? And we had spoken about this before. That was it the scholars of Jarh wa Ta'dil, were they the only ones that spoke about narrators? No. Right? It's like more people spoke about them, right? It wasn't just them, but if we have, all of these people are speaking about narrators, we're not going to listen to everyone. We're only going to listen to people who are specialized in that science and who are approved in that list. So over here are some examples of people who spoke about narrators, but the value of them speaking about it was, it's not acceptable. It's not something that would even be considered. So the chain of narration going back to the imam is not sound. We had talked about it before, that you can actually study the asanid of Jarh wa Ta'dil. You can actually study the statements. Is it something that is traceable back to that particular imam? Is it something that he actually said? Mistake. So it was a mistake in how the statement was narrated. And this can be in different ways. There are 2 examples here. The ascription to the narrator being spoken about, meaning that the imam spoke about Abdullah, but he didn't mean this Abdullah, he meant another one, right? So that mistake is something that can happen and is feasible and is reasonable. Or the one who is narrating it, he left off what would give context to the intention behind the statement. So, for example, he would say, he's weak, right? He is weak. And then when you look at the whole statement, he is weaker than Ahmed. So does that mean that the narrator is weak? No, right? Because he left out an important context. He left out something that was important that would help given context to what it was that he was saying to actually change the ruling on a particular narrator. So that the Imam himself made a mistake. So is it possible that the Imam himself makes a mistake on, like, these men, they memorize like thousands of names, right? There are thousands of names, thousands of narrators, who these individuals knew. Is it possible that they made a mistake in their particular rulings? Yeah, absolutely, right? They're human, and it's something that's not strange. And so if he makes a mistake on a narrator in actually determining who he is, then that will also in turn make a mistake on the ruling on that particular narrator. Something that's unacceptable. So when we have jarh mufassar or ta'dil mufassar, like, when we have it, the disparagement or the praise is clarified, and those reasons are not sound, right? Those aren't acceptable reasons. Then in turn, we would not accept the ruling. Misunderstood. So what the critic was saying is misunderstood, opposed to what he actually meant. So, I'm sorry? Like the shit, yeah. So that thing, it'll actually come a little bit later, and we'll talk about it more. But this is more along the lines of, for example, if he said, Khalid ad'af min Muhammad, right? So Khalid is weaker than Muhammad. Does he mean that Khalid is weak? No, not necessarily. He's just saying that when you compare these two, he's lower, right? He's of a lower level. So, but there are ways that people misunderstand that to mean that he's actually weak. Misascribed. So the statement of Jarh wa Ta'dil is ascribed to someone other than the one who actually made it. So the Imam is not the one who actually said it. It's misapplied, and it's applied to someone else. And that the problem with that is that if you apply the statement to someone else, it's not necessary that this other person is, right, from that accepted list of scholars. Or it could be misapplied. So sometimes it's important to understand that there can be a difference of opinion concerning it. So, for example, if you have one naqid, one hadith critic, and he says about a narrator, he's majhul, he's unknown. And then you have another scholar saying that this narrator is, for example, abandoned. One scholar says he's unknown, the other one says that he is abandoned. So, if I have both of these situations, I have the situation where one scholar says he's not known, and another one saying that he is, how do we reconcile that? Right, so it's possible that he never met him at all. So, but not having a ruling on someone, is that a reason for me to praise or dispraise him? No, right? It's not. I need what? I need facts. I need more information. It's not enough for me to say, oh, he's unknown. If a person is unknown, this is not reason for me to reject his narration or accept them. And when do we consider these disparagement, right? When do we consider this praise? When we have a difference of opinion, right? When there's a difference of opinion about a particular narrator, then that requires more investigation. I'm sorry? Right? It definitely requires more research and investigation. Timeline. So sometimes there's a difference between an early critic like Ibn Ma'in and a later critic like Imam al-Dhahabi or Ibn Hajar. And you're talking about like 400 years difference between them. And unless they're relying on an early critic. So over here, if I have an early critic saying that his narrations are rejected, and I have a later critic saying that his narrations are accepted, who am I going to rely on, the earlier or the later? I'm going to rely on the earlier scholars, right? Why is that? Because they lived in the time of narration, right? So an active narration was going on. They lived during that time. And their opinion is going to be given more weight. So why would anyone even claim this? Why would anyone claim, like, no, you would take the opinion of later scholars? I'm sorry? So you're talking about like a 400-year difference here. Is it possible that Dhahabi or Ibn Hajar, they met any of the narrators? No, it's impossible. What argument could anyone make saying that, no, this is what I prefer? Or what has happened is that you actually have scholars who will rely on the later day opinions and they'll make their rulings based off of that. Okay, so this is an argument. This is an argument that is made that say, oh, well, they have access to more research, right? They have access to more books. Why is that? Why is that problematic or not? Well, the culture is not going to affect the ruling, right? The culture is going to affect the ruling during the time of the ruling. So I want to kind of expand on this point a little bit. But by saying they had access to more information, is that true? Yeah. Okay. He's saying no, and you're saying possibly. Taib. Why possibly and why no? Is written. Okay, so you're saying that it's written and it's available and they could read it. Okay. Taib. No. Why? So there's a difference between having more information and the correct understanding. So which one do you want to stand? Which argument do you want to stand on? Uh, Okay, I'm okay with the accuracy, right? I don't even think there's a difference on that. But my question is now about the information. Who has more information? He's saying that, well, they have access to more books, the later ones, so it makes sense that we could actually rely on their opinion more. Sure, more work has been done. Okay, I agree with that. Tayyib. So I have another question. In that 400 years, were works lost, right? So it wasn't preserved 100%. So you have works that were lost. Is it possible that there are narrators that these earlier critics spoke about, they had information about them, but it's not necessarily recorded, and they still gave their ruling? Do they have access? So if I don't have access to a narrator, can I go talk to his neighbor? Yeah. So the thing is that the problem is, and the issue I have with the argument of the more information argument. Okay, well, these are the people who compile the information, and they all lived around the same time. And if you have specialists in a particular field, I'll come back to. If I have specialists in a particular field, was was the Muslim empire so vast that they couldn't travel to see each other? And we had shown the maps before, right? Of the traveling of. So what does that tell us about the Muslim empire, the early Muslim empire? And I will get to you, I promise. It was interconnected. It was easy to travel, and it was generally safe, right? You know, what I mean, if you have so many people traveling, you would. When do people travel? Generally, when it's safe or when it's unsafe, right? When it's safe. So they know that they could travel. They would say many times they would go with like their entire money. Sometimes they would go with nothing, right? And they would travel and they would seek this knowledge, and it was safe, and they had access to all of these scholars. So that interconnectivity between knowledge, it was generally there. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. When they were written down during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is like you're going back like about 20 classes where we discussed the actual recording of the hadith literature. So it was recorded. It started during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It continued more into the time of the companions. During the tabi'een, it became a lot, and then their students, they started even more so. And then the generation after them, you had more recording, more oral tradition. Like there was, it was stages of the recording that happened. So when did it start? During the time of the Prophet sallallahu, and it continued until about the 3rd century, where you had a vast majority of the hadith had been recorded and composed by that time. You had some additions in the 5th century, but by then, like most of the works had already been done and completed. Yeah. Um, is it ta'arud, differing, or I can't really like that's the one that's commonly used. I don't know too many synonyms that are used to represent it. So you have different sahifa, suhuf. So Abu Huraira had a suhuf, Abu Bakr had a suhuf, Amr ibn al-As, he had a sahifa, um, and then you had some of their students. They had suhuf too. and they made these first recordings. But like I said, akhi, these like you're going back like many classes. Yeah. The what? Allahu alam. I don't know. Yeah. So with what? So the information that you're talking about, like I said, akhi, during the time of active transmission, nothing was lost. No, they're all there. They're alive. What are you going to lose? Right? Like they were there. They existed. There's nothing that is to be lost. The problem is like you have from the time that after the fourth century, when most of the works in Rijal was done, all of the ones that came after that, all they did was they're just doing naql. They're just relaying the information from before, and sometimes information gets lost. How many libraries were burned between that time? How many wars did they undergo? Right there's just a lot of information that was lost between them and when they actually did their recordings. Not just that, between Ibn Hajar and us, we have lost. Like we've lost even more works in Allah Mustan. So that's why the argument that okay, no, they didn't have access to more information. They might have been able to organize the information they had better. That I can agree with, but I don't think they had access to more information though. So if after completing all these steps, the differences still stand. So if I have these differences of opinion and they still stand, what do I do? So I would go on to the next step of dealing with these differences, which is called reconcilability. Like, how do I reconcile? Right? Now that I have this ikhtilaf, right? If I went through these stages, I'm like, no, it can be ascribed. There's no mistake, right? They understood correctly. All of these things are there, and it's understood and it's established. How do I deal with this difference of opinion? Is it possible now for me to reconcile these statements? And within this, there are a number of stages. Number one, what was the context in which that statement was made? I need to look at all of these different statements, and I have to make sure that the context is correct in those statements. Sometimes the scholars, they use broad terms, right? So it wasn't like later scholars. Later scholars, when they actually had very specific levels. I'm sorry? Right? Not just details, like they use the terms in a different way. And we'll talk about that. I will spend a little bit more time. But basically, like if you go to the earlier scholars, they had three broad categories in which they kind of place people. And we had talked about this and mentioned this in the Muslim class, right? So even in hadith, how many categories did they have? Yeah, in the beginning there was only two. There was what? Right, Saqim and Sahih, the opposite, right? So either they were accepted or they were rejected, right? They weren't too concerned with having too many inter-categories, right? They said, okay, do we use this hadith or we don't, right? This is basically how it boiled down. It was only later scholars where we have now today, how many categories do we have? Right, we have five, right? There are five general categories that we use, all of them taken from Ibn Hajar, a later scholar. But in the early days, right? In the early days, like, even during the time of Bukhari and Muslim and all of them, they had two general categories of hadith. Do we use the hadith or do we reject it? So even within, so if that was the case with the ruling on hadith, what about the ruling on the narrators? Right? Does it make sense that they would have two categories here and like 20 categories for this? So application, looking at how the Imam applied his ruling. So basically, if I have two differing statements from different Imams, and he says that, laysa bi-shay, like he's nothing, right? I have that statement. This statement can mean a number of things, and I have another one who says he's saduq, he's acceptable, he's an acceptable narrator. What I'll do is I'll look at the laysa bi-shay. I'll say that okay, he's nothing. And then I'll go and I'll do research into, okay, how does this Imam actually rule on his ahadith? All right, because I have to look at the application. It's not enough for me to just look at the terms. I have to actually go at the application. And if I find in all of the hadith, all the hadith he's mentioned, he's actually accepted. All right, if he's the only one I'm looking at and I find that, okay, all the other narrators are okay, so he's not going to rule on them, but this narrator where he is right now, he's saying the hadith is sound, so what does that mean? To him, he's an acceptable narrator, right? He's an acceptable narrator. So application is something that's really important. Rare uses. Sometimes the Imam will use the term outside of his normal usage, right? So sometimes there'll be like a unique usage that other scholars might not have used. But this, I don't really think that. I think they're very, very specific cases. Specific uses. So some imams had unique uses of particular terminology, and then the linguistic use. So sometimes he doesn't mean the intention in the hadith science. He just means in a linguistic sense. And we'll talk about some of these and we'll mention them inshallah. Some important notes. At this stage, it's important to understand with precision the terms being utilized and how they're being utilized by hadith critics. We had spoken about this. They didn't have like a number of different levels for this. They are just in general concerned with three general levels, which we'll talk about inshallah. So the term da'if is something that we use today to mean weak, but it can apply to someone who's still considered an acceptable narrator. Right, so that's in a comparative sense. But even when they say da'if can mean the lowest part of what? Of an acceptable narrator, right? Because you have to understand, acceptance is a spectrum, but rejection is also a spectrum, right? So you have some, maybe he has some problems in his memory, he makes mistakes. I'll say, well, I don't know, I can't trust this hadith, but this person, he's a liar. Are they the same? No, right? They're completely different. This one I'll reject all the time. This person I'll be like, okay, well, you know, there are a few other corroborating reports with him, so I think this hadith he didn't make a mistake in. So I can actually raise the level up for that. So context. So if we had someone, for example, who was ruled on being weak in one land and not another. So for example, they would say that when he was narrating in Sham, his hadith would be rejected, but if he's narrating in Kufa, his hadith would be accepted. And there can be reasons for that. What do you think those reasons are? Right, age can be a part of it, right? He gets to a point where by the time he reached Kufa, his memory started getting weak. That's one possibility. What are some other possibilities? His teachers, right? So in Sham, his teachers were what? They were good. Right, he had good teachers, and then when he went to Kufa, he was a stranger, he didn't really know anyone, and he started sitting with these teachers, but all the teachers were what? They're weak, right? They weren't good teachers. So is the problem with the narrator? No, not necessarily. The problem can be from who he sat with and who he benefited from. One ruled on for being weak due to him narrating on a particular group of people. So you will find that it's a very similar case. Right, it's a very similar case to the previous one. The only difference being that one is connected to a place and the other one is connected to people. Right. The third one ruled on for being weak due to a particular group of people narrating on him. So you'll find that the way that these situations differ is that the first one, he's narrating on others, like he's listening and he's narrating. The problem is in the teachers. In the second situation, he is narrating too, and the problem is where? Right, the students, right? The problem is the students in that case, because over here, when he was teaching here, all the narrations seem fine. He's narrating to these students now, and all the narrations are weak. What happened? Right, it could be a problem with the students, or it could be a problem with him himself. Right? It could be, the problem could be he himself, just like you said, like, you know, maybe something changed. Maybe he lost his books, right? Maybe he started forgetting, right? You have to understand, like, narrators are human, right? Narrators are human. Human things happen to humans. And when these things happen, all of these possibilities can definitely stand. So one ruled on for being weak due to him narrating on unknown narrators with the possibility of nakara, yani of rejection, being from them, not him. So you'll find that he's going to be weak when he narrates on majhulin. So when he narrates on unknown narrators, his narrations are rejected. But when he narrates on people who are known, his narrations are accepted. Why? What's happened? What do you think happened? They're wrong, right? So, and not just that, the narrators themselves are they're unknown. Right? They're unknown. So there's a possibility, because when he has a chain, we find that his narrations are fine. And when his chain has a break, right, you have an unknown narrator there. So now the problem, it doesn't seem like it's from him. The problem is from his teachers. The next one ruled on for being weak or accepted if he narrates from particular narrators. So if he has specific mashayikh, meaning that his narrations are only acceptable if he narrates from Zuhri. Because all of the other teachers are what? They're all weak. And this is commonly found in discussions of a particular level. So you have something called tabaqa. The tabaqa is the level or where the placement in the chain, right? So you have a placement in the chain. When you have discussions of a particular tabaqa, this is where you'll find these discussions. That his narrations are accepted when he narrates on this particular sheikh. And the example of Zuhri is one, and Amish is the other. One who's considered precise or weak in narrating a particular science versus other sciences. So when he narrates in halal and haram, his narrations are sound, but when he narrates in fadail, in virtues, his hadith are rejected. When he narrates qira'at, right? When he narrates qira'at, when he narrates the different readings of the Quran, his narrations are sound, but if he narrates in anything else, his narrations are weak. Right? It happens. Why? People specialize in different things, right? There are different sciences people specialize in, so it's not strange to find scholars being sound in one thing, strong in one thing, and weak in others. Yeah. You know, if he's speaking in this science, we accept it. If he speaks in that science, we reject it. Or like when he speaks on history, right? When he speaks in history, his narrations are okay. If he speaks on anything else, we don't take them. One we can do to innovation. And that there's no other reason by a critic known to be harsh with innovators. Why was this done? We had spoken about this before, that in general, narration from innovators is what? Accepted or rejected? I want you guys to think. Yeah, you got to think, man. Why are narrations rejected in general? There are two major reasons. What are they? I'm sorry. Oh, if it's a lie, good. Or if it's a distortion is a lie, right? If you're doing it purposely. If it's a mistake, right? So if it's a lie or a mistake. So, right. And yeah, it's accepted as long as he's known to be what? Not lying, right? He's known to, no. If he's known to be truthful. Right? He's known to be truthful. Because the person who's on innovation, he's doing it thinking what? That this is deen, right? He thinks, no, this is the right way to understand the religion. And so why would he want to narrate something that hurts the religion? Does that make sense? Now, he might narrate something that aids him in his innovation, but we had spoken about this before. You have a number of innovators, they actually narrate hadith that what? That weaken their arguments. So somebody who's narrating a hadith that weakens his argument, what does it say about him though? It doesn't say he's contradictory. That he's not trustworthy? He's narrating something that's against him. Right? It shows that he's trustworthy. It shows that he's truthful. That is like the idea of carrying something forward that the Prophet ﷺ was more important to him than what? Than his own belief. So the reason that you would have classical scholars saying that I don't narrate from innovators, you'd have a number of reasons from them, but basically it was to make sure that people avoided what? Not necessarily the ideology, ahsant, right? So because you wanted people to avoid the innovation. So what you would do is that you wouldn't try to do what with the narrator. Like you didn't want to elevate the narrator. You didn't want to make him popular because you didn't want people to be drawn to his ideas. But at the same time, transmitting the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is a what? It's important. It's an amana. It's a trust. So creating that balancing act is something that's important. So what did they do? What they would try to do is that they would try to find the same hadith, but where? With someone else, right? They would try to find another isnad, and if they found that, man, I can't find this hadith except through this isnad, so what would they do? They would narrate it. So sometimes they would weaken them out of caution, so that people would avoid that particular innovation, etc. So some scholars used to charge to narrate. So what would happen is, like, there was actually, I forgot his name, but there was a narrator who lived in Mecca, and when people would come to Mecca, they would say, hey, narrate to us hadith. He'd be like, okay, no problem. It'll cost you money. So you had other what do you guys think? You think that's a problem? It's a huge problem? So there's a difference between fi sabilillah and free sabilillah, right? So who decides somebody else's intention? Right? Like we have control over our intention. I cannot force an intention upon you. I cannot force anyone to do anything for free, with the threat that you need to do this for Allah. Because I can threaten him to do it for Allah. I can force you to vacuum the for example, the musalla right now. Does it mean that that person is actually doing it for Allah? No. And is it possible that somebody's being paid for something and he still does it for Allah? Absolutely. Right? There's no contradiction there. Yeah. Hmm. Uh-huh. So do I decide that? Do I decide that, or does the person decide that? I agree with you, Akhi. But who decides that? Do I decide it or the person who's narrating? No, he decides it. Right? His reason is what? That there's no work in Makkah. There's no work in Makkah. And not just that, do people need to take hadith from him? No, it's not necessary. Is it ideal? No. Right? There's a difference between something being ideal and something actually lowering the status of that person. Another very famous example of this, and I've heard this from many people. I remember I went to a masjid one time, and the guy was like, he's like, yeah, we're not interested in paying the khatibs to give khutbahs. I was like, okay. He was like, so can you come down? I was like, no, you guys don't pay your khatibs. I was like, I'm going to make a 2-hour drive. Why? I was like, well, he was like, and I was like, is it a service that you can offer? Is it something that you can do? He's like, no. I was like, so don't you pay other people for services? I was like, do you have a store by chance? He was like, yeah, I own a restaurant. I was like, why do you charge people for food? Do it for Allah. There are services that are provided, whether teaching Quran, leading the prayers, these are all services that are being provided. And the person who's providing the service, what is he supposed to do? Rely on Allah, right? Do you understand? Like it starts getting very tricky. Like when we start forcing this idea on people that the only way you can do something for Allah is what? For free. That's not the case. Intention is something that is individual. That's something that the individual decides. You can pay someone $1 million and his intention is so correct that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts it. And there's someone who can take nothing and maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reject that action. Huh? Like even giving charity, like even giving money, right? So even giving money, forget taking it. Even giving money, is it necessary that Allah accepts? No. Why? Because I might not be doing it fi sabilillah. Might not be doing it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. So when it comes to situations like this, are there scholars who had a problem with this? Yeah. There's scholars who had a major problem from this. His hadith are weak because what? He used to charge to narrate. But other scholars are like, no, man, like he's charging to narrate. Who is forcing you to take his hadith? Or are you upset that he's charging, right? Or that you didn't come up with the idea first? And because the thing is, like, other scholars, some of them had extra jobs, some of them were receiving stipends, right? Some of them received inheritance. Imam Nasa'i, well known for this. Imam Bukhari, well known for this. Like, they spent all of their inheritance seeking knowledge. This is what they did. So how people use their money, how people take their money, how people give their money, that's the individual decision. It's not a decision I can make for anyone else. Does that make sense? Right, this is something that someone else decides. Not just, I had a brother, he had asked me about leading Taraweeh in one of the masajid. He was like, yeah, Sheikh, he's the fi sabilillah thing. I said, okay, give the money back. I said, take the money and give it back. I said, will that not serve the same purpose? And he was like, okay, well, why should I take the money in the first place? I was like, because people need to learn to value services. This chair, how do I measure how tall it is? With inches, right? I use inches to measure how tall it is. If I want to know how heavy it is, what do I use? I use pounds, right? I use pounds, I use a scale. How do I determine the value of that chair? What do I use to measure that? Dollars. Right? Very simply. If I want to know what the value of this chair is, I'll put a dollar sign next to it. It's the same thing with any service. How come doctors can charge more for their service than electricians, than plumbers, than taxi drivers? The skill, right? It's not necessarily the person himself, but like that skill is considered more valuable. And how do we as a society measure that value? With the dollar sign. Sometimes I'm willing to pay for services, other people aren't willing to pay for that service. Why? Because I value that service more. So how we value these things, and it's the same thing, man. Like whatever these professional positions are, if we value a service, then what do we naturally do? We put a $sign next to it. So, and in those spaces, people are like, oh, well, we're not getting quality imams, or we're not getting quality teachers, we're not getting quality this. Well, usually quality is associated with what? With the $sign. And it's not bad, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Now, what that individual does with his money, that's between him and Allah. Maybe at least we as a community should what? Value the service. Right, that's our job. We should value the service. How much that service is valued, it's going to depend. Why are their salaries high, and why are some imams salaries low? Because the service they're providing is what? Is valued, right? And if their service isn't valued, then the pay is going to be lower. So anyway, there are some scholars who had a problem with this. They're like, no, you shouldn't charge, and you shouldn't, do these things. But it's not a reason that you can disparage someone. You can't. This is not a reason for jarh. His narrations are to be accepted because there's no proof that he's what? There's some, but so when we start talking about the nature of the hadith critics, you'll find that some hadith critics, they were more what? They're more conservative, right? And they would be harsh in their judgments. Like when we did in the Sahih Muslim class, you were there? Okay, so we talked about Abu Zubair. And then you had, I think it was Shu'bah. Shu'bah was he rejected his narrations, and he was like, oh, he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this. But if you actually look at those individual points, you'll be like, okay, but there's no, Like he wasn't doing anything wrong, right? Right? Your perception, you thought oh, he's like this, but he wasn't really doing anything wrong. And it's the same thing here. So you had those scholars who we call mutashaddid, that they would be harsh. They were harsh in their critique. Why? Because their nature was like that, right? They were generally, even Yahya ibn Ma'in, kana mazzah. Like he used to joke a lot, right? He used to joke a lot. So how did his joking translate? It translated when he would speak about people. He'd be like, oh, he's a himar, like he's a donkey, or he's like, he would say things like this. Not because he's making fun, but because he jokes, it came out in the way that he actually did jarh, right? And then you have those who are known as mutasahil, like they'd be like they would take it easy in their rulings. So understanding also the nature of the hadith critic, it will help you on the scale on how to judge a particular narrator, and it's well known. You would have the narrator, you would have the scholars speaking about each other. كان متشدد, right? Like, and he used to be harsh, and he's كان متساهل, like he was very easy, and he would give easy rulings on them. So, and we'll talk about some of those scholars, inshallah. But again, it's important to realize that that difference of opinion has to do more with this, because you'll find that it's even the mutawassitin, those who are considered in the middle, like Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he was considered to be like mutawassit, that he wasn't harsh, he didn't lean either way. Even he would say things like, okay, that's not a reason for someone to make jarh. It's like, no, he went too easy on him. Like his narration shouldn't be written down and recorded. One who we can do to him narrating with ijaza. So we haven't talked about it, but basically we mentioned it. There are different ways to narrate, right? I read on the sheikh read to me, I sat in the sheikh's majlis, it was read to him, this and this, and during the gathering. Then the weakest way of transmitting is something that's called ijaza. Ijaza would basically, you would go to the sheikh, you might read a hadith or two, maybe three, maybe you won't read any, and he'd be like, ujizuka, like, I give you permission to narrate my book, without hearing or without listening. The problem the muhaddithin had with this way of transmitting hadith is that it's very possible that the person who is transmitting can make mistakes. And not just that, the books that the scholars had, did they have photocopy machines? Like, how did I get a book of hadith? Right, I'd have to pay a scribe to actually be like, and they would have copies, right? They would have copies. I would go buy this copy from the scribe, and sometimes they would go be like, Sheikh, I have your narrations. He'd be like, Khalas, ujizik, I give you ijaza to go narrate my hadith. Other scholars would be like, okay, how did you get this hadith? He said, I got it ijazatan. They'd be like, okay, no, these hadith aren't accepted. Unless you heard it from him or you read it to him, we're not going to accept the hadith. Other ones, one who is weakened at one point in his life versus another. So the mukhtalit, this is somebody we had spoken about and spent some time about before, but basically the mukhtalit is one who has changed, right? He's changed due to some trauma or due to some issues. So there are three examples here. One whose eyesight weakened toward the end of his life. Why did this become a problem? Because he used to narrate from his books, right? And the moment he was unable to see, what happens? The narrations become weak. He starts making more mistakes. The second one whose library are burnt or lost. This is something that's very common. A very famous example of this is Abdullah ibn Lahiya. Whoever would repeat when his students would say, I narrate from. Basically, you would have students who would come and they would say to the Sheikh, say, I narrate from. And the Sheikh, what would he do? He'd be like, Haddathana. He'd say, I narrate from. And this is something that's called talqeen. And any time the scholars heard that, hey, he used to practice talqeen, what would they do with his narrations? They'd reject him. He says, like, yeah, you didn't actually hear this. And he's not lying because his students told him to say it. Wait, you understand the problem here? And the reason they used to do that is because it allowed them many times to remove intermediaries and allowed their chains to be shorter, and it made it appear that they had very short chains and that they had very unique hadith. It's like a short, is it short? SubhanAllah, man, like in every science, right? You know what I mean? Like every profession, you'll find people who are always looking for shortcuts. May Allah protect us. So one who is weakened when he narrates from his memory, but accepts if he narrates from his record. The opposite. Do you guys think that's a realistic possibility? Somebody who's weak when he narrates from his books, but he's strong when he narrates from his memory? No, that doesn't make any sense, right? So you don't have any situations of that. And one who is comparatively strengthened or weakened against one another. He's weaker than so-and-so, or he's stronger than so-and-so. So what happens sometimes is the focus becomes here versus here, right? So the focus should be the comparison. It shouldn't be the actual terms in the words that are being used. One who is weakened due to tadlis. We had spoken about this before. So there are some scholars who had problems with any type of tadlis, right? So whenever there was tadlis, they would reject their narrations. But this is conditional and it requires further investigation. So for example, Ghiyath ibn Ibrahim, every time he's declared weak because of his tadlis, scholars would say, no, yes, he is weak, right? And his narrations are not to be versus Baqi' ibn Walid, his weakness is rejected. So when the scholars say he's weak because of his tadlis, that's actually not true. He was somebody who was very sound. He was somebody who was very upright, but he used to practice tadlis a lot. So anytime you can establish sama'a, then his narrations would be accepted. The broad terms, we had talked about this and mentioned this, but classical critics, they didn't have these strict levels, right? Like we said, we have the five layers for hadith today. They didn't have like different layers for the narrators. So basically what happened, they weren't interested in particular terminologies. They were just they just wanted to represent, or they wanted to share what they felt about those particular narrators. So acceptance and rejection, like we said, is a spectrum. You will have some people are at the highest level of acceptance, some people are at the lowest level of acceptance, and the same thing with rejection, right? Some people are at the lowest level, some people are at the highest levels. And this is in opposition to later scholars. Later scholars, they actually exaggerated these stages and levels because they were interested, many times more interested in classifying these things because it allowed them to make these levels of where these narrators actually are. So having the accuracy is good. It's just problematic, and we'll talk about some of the reasons for that, right? Like, because you're talking about people. You know what I mean? Like, it's very difficult to say, okay, for example, anybody you know, think of anyone you know, can you tell me that his hifz is at level 7? Right? It's tough, right? It's difficult to actually qualify and quantify people in that sense, in those terms. So over here, Imam al-Dhahabi, he says in his Mawqidah, and like we said, he's a later scholar, he died 748. He said, we are in need of clarifying the terms used in Jarh wa Ta'dil and clarification of terms that appear as opposing. So sometimes there are opposing terms, right, that don't necessarily clarify, and he says that we need clarification in those stages. So how do we show that they were actually general categories? Like, so this argument that, okay, they didn't mean precision, what are some ways for us to show us? Well, there are two major means. So you'll have the critic himself admitting that. He himself will say, okay, these are meant to be general categories and they're not meant to be specific. Or secondly, that when he uses a particular term, then the term itself will show that this is meant to be broad, right? It's not meant to be very precise. Yeah, and I'll show some examples, inshallah. So after analyzing those things, we'll find that there are 3 general categories for narrators. Either they were accepted, or they were rejected, or they were right there accepted with conditions. Right, that's it. Like basically, you have accepted, rejected, and in between. Yes. Wa alaikum assalam. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much. And if you actually look at it and you go through the narrators, you'll find what? That all of them will fall into one of these three categories. Some common misconceptions. So the term saduq. The term saduq, it means truthful. And some scholars will say, okay, well, saduq is actually a lower level of thiqa, trustworthy. But both of them indicate acceptance. The other problem is that there are some scholars that are early scholars who use the word saduq and they applied it to narrators that these later scholars said were thiqa. Yes. Semantics? Semantics, well, you would say that يعني الفرق لفظي, that the difference is in the wording. لا معنوي, not in the meaning. I just told you, is that the difference is lovely. You would say it's just the difference in wording. I understand, أخي. You would just say الفرق لفظي. You say that it's a الفرق لفظي. Yeah, ألف لام فاء راء قاف الفرق لفظي. Yeah, and then لفظي لام فاء ضاد واو yeah. ألف لام لا ألف لام لام فاء ضاد not ضاد ضاء yeah. عفوا. So this only comes into play when there's a difference of opinion concerning the level. Yeah, again, it's more semantics, right? Just these terminologies, again, they're meant to represent either accepted or rejected. فيه لين. So فيه لين is another common terminology that's used, meaning that there's some weakness. And some scholars will say that this is in opposition to ضعيف, even though the term indicates a lighter type of weakness. This only comes into play, again, when there is a difference of opinion concerning level. Why were they so broad? There are a number of reasons. Number one, it was more important to understand the general ruling than it was the specific level. Secondly, the difficulty, and this is what we were talking about, Ibrahim, right? Due to the subjective nature of grading, it's very difficult to place somebody at a specific level. And this shows more so, and this appears more so during the differences of opinion. And lastly, the lack of resources. Meaning that even though the hadith critics were extremely resourceful, they still didn't have enough resources to sit down, gather all of the narrators and do what? Like just compare them all. They had enough information to give a ruling, right? But it wasn't enough information to what? To place them in these very tight, specific, precise categories. Why? Because it goes against the goal, right? If you're trying to build a hadith encyclopedia, a hadith database, like a scholar database and like a narrator database, what benefit would it have been for them to go so precise? Because there's more time consumption that's involved there, and it didn't make sense for them because it's like, okay, they're trying their best to gather up as many narrations that they can, so they did have this time restriction that was there. Yeah, because again, why? Because they're concerned with what? Yes or no, right? Like, do we accept it or do we not? They're not concerned like, oh, is he level 7 or is he level 7 or 8? You know what I mean? Like that stuff, it wasn't a big deal. Like, because it didn't practically make a difference. The only time it did make a difference is when there was a comparison. And in that comparison, that is more for our benefit in terms of like, okay, is he more or is he less within the category itself? Yes. Netma, you sit the farthest, you speak the softest, and then like I feel like I have to walk closer every week. Yeah. Should I just move the chairs in the back? Okay, fine. Uh-huh. Yes. Yeah, no, within the same century. Within the same century. Yeah. So like Imam Bukhari, for example, he died 256 Hijri. In within that time period, you still have narrators who were still living. Yeah. So they could go and visit. They could sit down with them. They used to test them. There's a lot of stuff that was done. Yep. Cause. But we'll stop here, inshallah, and like I think that covers why they were so broad, and we'll continue this بإذن الله next week. والله أعلم وصلى الله على خير خلق نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.